What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and I hope you're all doing well today. As a lot of you folks probably know, I've basically mained a rogue for forever, like 15 plus years, and it's the class that I identify as and do basically all of my competitive and hardcore content, or whatever you want to call it. However, with the Mage Tower returning and part of the Legion time walking events that'll happen every few months, I decided I really wanted to earn the Flying Book mount from the meta achievement, which means doing some leveling and Mage Tower shenanigans on other classes. I also really wanted to get the Fel Werebear Guardian Druid form, since I didn't have a Druid back during Legion, so I couldn't get the original one. The Druid Mage Tower armor is kinda cool too, but Druids are in shapeshift forms like 99% of the time, so the armor was kind of a whatever thing for me, and really I just wanted the bear. Being the masochist that I am, I decided to level my druid and give it a shot, since to get the book mount I needed to do a tank challenge in the Mage Tower anyhow, and I figured I could knock two birds out with one stone, so to speak. This video will be a guide of all the things I did, the items I used, some tips, and a full video of my successful completion of defeating Highlord Kruul. This took a lot of pulls, like, well over 100, probably closer to like 140-ish. I hated most of it, and frankly I am practically traumatized when I see knockback effects now anywhere else in the game. Since I lost count of how many times I wiped unless I didn't have deadly boss mods installed for this until the very end of my attempts, I can't give an exact amount, but seeing as I ended up with almost 200 gigs worth of footage of just the Guardian Druid Mage Tower, yeah, it was a lot. A preface and explanation before going into this whole video. I'm not a tank. I've basically never tanked ever, outside of maybe a couple random Mythic Plus keys here and there over the last, 2 expansions. So the number of attempts I had was probably a lot due to basically learning an entire class and spec at the same time as learning an arguably hard fight, and it's one of the hardest ones for tanks according to other people I've talked to. I also did use older gear and consumables, because I'm honestly amazed that anyone's able to do this without using anything like that, unless you already have actual tanking gear and tanking trinkets, which I didn't really have, and I didn't want to farm current content when I could do older stuff and it'd make it easier. Frankly, I don't think I'm good enough to do this fight at the bare minimum without at least the 2 trinkets that I use, but the whole point of this video is to show a way that even non-tank players can get this challenge done without breaking their monitor, keyboard, mouse, headset, or a window, or maybe any combination of the both, as I almost did. I have everything timestamped and segmented out, so hopefully it's easy for you to glean some insight from this video. With all that out of the way, we'll go over gear, talents, and consumables I used for this encounter first. I basically ran Siege of Orgrimmar, the raid in Mists of Pandaria, on Heroic and Mythic difficulty, as I didn't want to spend really any gold that I didn't have to, since the market for old crafted gear and weird best-in-slot Mage Tower gear has been insane on Area 52, so I'm sure it's really expensive on other servers too. I have a jewel crafter that I leveled really quick in Pandaren jewel crafting, and I did a video on that like a week or so ago, so I basically got all the gems that I used for free. I just used the +3 agility primordial ruby since I got basically all of those while leveling my mining and jewel crafting, so it worked out pretty good. Staying at or under item level 50 on the gear you're using for the Mage Tower is really important, since a lot of your older enchants from other expansions can't be put on anything higher than that. Like the Greater Tiger Claw inscription enchant for your shoulders that gives +5 agility and +2 crit, or the Cloak enchant Lesser Power which gives +6 of your primary stat also. I'll probably just end up leaving a list or something in a pinned comment so you can have an easier time looking over the things that I used for the challenge, since this will get really wordy and complicated otherwise, and it's probably already going to get really wordy and complicated. I basically found various old enchants that gave attack power boosts or agility boosts, since agility just translates into attack power anyhow, and the attack power enchants were way cheaper. You do lose out on a tiny bit of dodge chance that you get from getting agility instead of attack power, but it was really minor, and again, I didn't want to spend a ton of money on this. Probably the 2 most important gear things I can recommend though are to use your artifact weapons from Legion and to get some good trinkets. The nice thing about the old Legion weapons for Feral and Guardian is that you actually dual wield them, which means you wear an extra weapon enchant on your offhand. If you try to dual wield regular weapons though, like gear from Shadowlands, the game won't let you, so yeah, you have to get your old Fangs of Ashamain or your Claws of Ursoc out for the challenge, and it will help you a lot. If you never unlocked either of those before, then that's even better, as there is another trick you can do. I personally ended up using the Dancing Steel enchant and Force Multiplier for my weapon enchants because the big primary stat procs are really good when scaled down in the Mage Tower. To apply the Dancing Steel enchant to an artifact weapon though, it has to be at item level 50 or lower, just like those other things I mentioned, which requires farming low level relics, which can be kinda tricky. I never played in Legion on this druid, so I was able to make this work out, but otherwise I would have used Force Multiplier and Celestial Guidance instead, since both of those can be put on higher level stuff too. I also basically power leveled through dungeons, so I went back and unlocked the Heart of Azeroth artifact necklace from BFA since I didn't have it, which is honestly just a nice neck for the tons of stats that it has compared to other items, so it's a pretty good choice. For trinkets, the Ravaged Seed Pod from Nythendra, the first boss of the Emerald Nightmare raid, was a massive help in the fight, as it made Phase 1 really fast and predictable and helped a lot in Phase 2 also. The other trinket I used was the Unblinking Gaze of Seth. This comes from Shadowlord Iskar in the Hellfire Citadel raid from Warlords of Draenor, and was a caster trinket that basically does beams of AoE damage and it procs really often. You'll be using Moonfire quite a bit during this fight, so it's just another source of free and pretty consistent cleave damage. I've heard other people suggest like the Ghost Iron Dragonling trinket too, but I never got around to making that one. That's an engineering trinket from Mists of Pandaria, and it does pretty respectable damage supposedly, and it lets you choose what stats are on it since it has cogwheel sockets, which you can make with Mists of Pandaria's engineering profession as well. I also ended up just buying some super cheap crafted rings from Shadowlands since I was lazy, and I just wanted some higher level rings to put a Leviathan's Eye of Agility and a Kraken's Eye of Agility in. You could have used other things, but they were just the first things I grabbed because they were like 200 gold each, and it was a really easy way to guarantee that I had haste and versatility secondary stats on those rings. Again, there will be a full list and a pinned comment of all the junk that I used to make this happen, but I can't say if Blizzard's going to tune any of this gear, so do be mindful of that. I honestly didn't really bother looking into stat weights or stat priorities that much. I just grabbed the first verse haste rings that I saw in the auction house, as those are both really good stats for current content, Guardian Druid stuff, so I just tried to grab at least a little bit of it, because most of my other gear didn't have very much verse on it since it was old content gear. And now onto my talent choices. There have been a couple different choices in the levels 30, 35, and 40 rows, but this was the loadout that worked for me, and it felt slightly more durable than what I originally tried, which was like a balanced druid, Heart of the Wild type setup, and that's what a lot of people use, but this is what I used. Brambles is basically free damage and damage mitigation, and we'll be using it basically every time that ads show up in the encounter to help AoE them down faster. Wild Charge is exceptionally useful and has saved my life literally multiple times, and during the kill footage I'm pretty sure I used it at least once to save me. There are a metric ton of knockbacks and pushbacks in this fight, and this is one of the ways you can save yourself from an extremely annoying wipe. Next, I ended up going with Restoration Affinity, as I found the extra threat generation from having an instant cast hot via Rejuvenation and then a Swift Mend to follow it up was a fast way to top myself up and to get more threat. Ursol's Vortex is also a really awesome Resto Affinity ability since you can drop it on top of Infernals and help keep them in place a little longer to give you a little more breathing room. Mighty Bash is very useful too, as it lets you delay the Annihilate casts in Phase 2 from Kruul, and it lets you stop Variss if you accidentally miss the Drain Life interrupt, which can again help prevent an annoying wipe. Incarnation Guardian of Ursoc worked quite well for me, as it gives a larger health pool to help make the Annihilate casts not quite as scary, it makes Mangle hit more targets, and it makes it a 30-second long buff over the 15-second long buff of Berserk, which will last the majority of Phase 2. Survival of the Fittest is a very important talent for this fight, since it reduces the cooldown of Barkskin to be short enough that you'll have it for every time you need it. Lastly, Rend and Tear is an easy way to increase your damage dealt to all targets hit by your Thrash, and you take slightly less damage from them too, so during Incarnation it's very easy to quickly get 3 stacks of Thrash on anything you want. And now for consumables. I used a Greater Flask of the Currents, which was the BFA Alchemy Flask, and it scales better in the Mage Tower than basically any other flask available currently. I used Bear Tartar for my food, which is a food from Legion that gives you a burst of speed whenever you kill any enemies in the fight, which is really handy for avoiding mechanics and enemies' attacks, especially those damned Infernals with their stupid knockback slams. I don't think I've ever hated knockbacks more than in this encounter in literally 15 plus years of playing WoW. For weapon augments, I chose 2 Adamantite Sharpening Stones, which come from Burning Crusade Blacksmithing. These give a flat weapon damage increase instead of attack power, plus a little bit of crit, but the big gain is from that increased weapon damage, because increasing weapon damage is better than increasing attack power. However, if you're using the artifact weapon with the dual wielding trick I mentioned, you'll notice you don't get a damage boost by augmenting your offhand's weapon damage with the adamantite sharpening stone, and it just gives the crit buff. Instead, I would actually recommend using a shaded sharpening stone for your offhand artifact weapon, as the boost to attack power will still count towards your overall damage output, even on your offhand weapon. The reason I keep mentioning sharpening stones instead of weight stones is because I ended up using my Feral Druid's artifact weapons instead of my Guardian Druid ones, because my Guardian Druid ones I accidentally made above item level 50 due to the relics I put in. So with my Feral one, I was able to stay under item level 50, which let me use the adamantite ones. If you go above 50, you have to use shaded sharpening stones or porous or any of the newer ones, so just keep that in mind. For a DPS potion, Potion of Unbridled Fury is a great option, since it does a good chunk of damage for free as long as you're using damaging abilities. These potions come from Battle for Azeroth Alchemy, and an added trick that I recommend is chugging one of these right before you enter the Mage Tower challenge. If you use the potion before you select starting the encounter, it'll reset the cooldown of the potion, but the buff will still be active. The beginning RP of the fight is about 35 seconds, so you should get about 25-ish seconds of using that potion, which can help a ton with pushing Phase 1 while still having your DPS potion usable for Phase 2. For health potions, Astral Healing Pots are basically the best ones since they were Legion's best potion and they don't get scaled down at all, so they'll heal you almost half of your health pool as a Guardian Druid, which is pretty handy. You'll only get one usage of it in the fight due to it being a 5-minute long cooldown and how short this encounter is, but it can help top you up if something goes terribly wrong. And for drums, I used Drums of Fury because I could make those for free thanks to my Garrison Leatherworking Hut in Draenor. You can really use like any drums you want to since they all work perfectly the same. If you really want to go all in, then you can buy War Scrolls of Battle Shout and War Scrolls of Fortitude for a 3% boost to your attack power and stamina respectively. But they are usually pretty expensive if you don't have a Battle for Azeroth scribe, and they go away every time you die, so this can add up really quickly. I farmed a lot of these consumables myself, but even then I still ended up spending at least like 50, 60,000 some odd gold while leveling professions and buying materials to make stuff, so this can get pretty expensive. You can also use augment runes as well, but that will again add to the price point of this fight, so take that as you want. Okay, so now that you know my secret shame of the lengths I went to make my Guardian Druid fight as reasonable as possible without going crazy with chromie time, rare, epic gear, scaling, and weird crap like that, we'll get into the fight. I strongly recommend you download the DBM Challenges module for Deadly Boss mods, as the audio reminders for certain mechanics will make this fight feel a lot less chaotic while you're learning, and having exact timings for most of the ad spawns is very helpful. My kill was about 4.5, maybe like 4 minutes 40 seconds long, excluding the RP time at the beginning where you can't do anything, and the shorter you can get this fight by DPSing your bare butt off, the better, which means being on top of your interrupts and ad spawns, and DBM helps you do that. The Highlord's return encounter is broken up into 2 phases, with Phase 1 being against Inquisitor Variss, and Phase 2 being against Highlord Kruul. Phase 1 is arguably much easier than Phase 2, although you have a lot of mechanics to learn at once. You will have one NPC to keep alive in Phase 1, Prophet Velen, and in Phase 2, Corvus Bloodthorn will be freed, and if either of these 2 NPCs die at any time, you instantly lose the fight. On the other hand, if you die and they're still alive, it is possible to still beat the Mage Tower if they can kill Kruul before they get slapped. Velen is the only useful one of the pair though, as he is going to spawn these glowing healing orbs of light in the encounter area. If you touch any of these, you will heal to full and all enemies on the screen will be disoriented for a few seconds. Our goal is to try and save as many of these orbs for the second half of the fight as we can, but they only last for 2 minutes, so you can safely use at least 1 orb, possibly 2, depending on your DPS and efficiency in Phase 1. Inquisitor Variss is this big floating jerk that you have to beat before Highlord Kruul will fight you in Phase 2. He has a black aura on the ground around him that reduces your maximum health by 10% for every stack of Aura of Decay you have, and you gain stacks wherever you're standing in that black aura. These last for 10 seconds, so you need to keep an eye on how many you have and how long before they fall off. I recommend never ever going above 6 stacks at the most while in bear form, because if you leave bear form to heal, then your health pool will be dramatically small and it could result in you being one-shot by Varys' spam spell Mind Rend. You can use one of those healing orbs to interrupt him if this does happen, so it's not necessarily a wipe if you get that many stacks, but just keep an eye on those healing orbs and pop one of them if you have too many stacks, so that way you have a little bit of wiggle room. Again, Mind Rend is his spammed move, so do not interrupt it basically ever, as you will need your Skull Bash up for drain life every time it's cast, as this move cannot go off. This move is channeled and will drain your health and heal the crap out of Variss, so basically just interrupt it immediately. I personally use a focus macro for my Skull Bash on this fight, which works really great if you actually remember to set Variss as your focus, which I of course forgot dozens of times, so yeah, set him as your focus while they're babbling before the fight starts, so that way you can just hit your interrupt, and as long as you're close enough, you'll charge in and stop the cast without even having to swap targets. Variss will spawn Tormenting Eyes around the room during Phase 1. These enemies can only be hurt with spells, so you'll have to hit them with your Moonfire to whittle them down. If you're lucky and get some critical hits, then you might be able to kill them with just one Moonfire, but I recommend hitting them with at least 2 so they die a little faster, and to extend the duration of the Moonfire debuff. These stupid eyeballs will be the cause of your death many times if you aren't careful, as they have a move called Inquisitive Gaze that is a 3-second long cast, and if you aren't looking directly at the eye when the cast ends, it'll knock you back about 30 or so yards, which is exceptionally annoying and can mess up your pull very quickly. You can in theory use this to your advantage sometimes, but you're better off just eliminating these jerks as promptly as you can. Throughout both Phase 1 and Phase 2, these 4 void portal things are going to open up around the room. After a few seconds, Nether Horror enemies will fly out and try to bum rush Velen. Their dangerous move is Nether Storm, which takes about 3.5 seconds to cast, but once they do, they start pulsing an insane amount of shadow damage, which will most likely kill you or Velen within 2 seconds. You need to get threat on these enemies as quickly as possible so you can clump them up and cleave them down on top of Variss. That way you can still deal with the adds while pushing damage onto the boss. I found that casting Regrowth and Rejuvenation on myself generated enough healing threat to frequently get their attention and have them come to me immediately. But you do also have Moonfire and Growl if you have a couple strays that you can't seem to get aggro on. Having Hots rolling on you and slapping Swiftmend on yourself right when they spawn but before they start running around seemed to work pretty nicely, and it made sure I was basically always nearly getting healing coming in. I'd also recommend a mouse over macro for Moonfire, as it's much easier for hitting the Nether Horrors and the eyes while running around like a madman. To stop all of them from casting Netherstorm, we'll be using Incapacitating Roar right as their cast is about to end, to give us the most possible time to DPS them. We'll also be using Barkskin while the portals are generating the Nether Horrors, and it should line up pretty well with all their spawns and gives us some extra damage output. We'll basically Thrash on cooldown and spam Swipe if Thrash is on cooldown, as there are 2 main AoE moves. Make sure to hit Variss with a Mangle if it's off cooldown, since it does 20% extra damage to bleeding targets, and we need to make sure we're getting damage in on Variss as much as we can. The Ravage Seed Pod Trinket should be available for every other wave of horrors since it's a 1-minute cooldown, so be sure to drop this under Variss. The Seed Pod does fantastic work against the horrors and can basically kill them for you in the time it's up. Lastly for Phase 1, we have Smoldering Infernals. The first one will spawn about 40 seconds into the fight, and the rest seem to spawn every minute after that. These big boys will make you hate the Legion more than anything else possible, as I guarantee most of my deaths in this fight were due to these stupid Infernals than anything else. They will slowly lumber towards you and they tick down in health passively. When they die, they go all incorporeal, and then they regenerate after like 30 seconds, and then they're back again to start trying to ruin your day. The longer Phase 1 takes, the more Infernals you'll have to deal with for the entire fight, including Phase 2, and these guys can completely ruin your run with one misstep. They'll slam the ground in front of them if you're within range, causing a huge shockwave that blows you halfway to the frickin' moon and is guaranteed to throw you off the platform almost every single time. When they're low on health, they'll shrink in size, and their knockback and slam become much smaller and less powerful, but don't let your guard down, as it can still screw you pretty bad. When the Infernals are active, they'll also sometimes pulse AoE damage out too, so you'll want to make sure you have at least 1 stack of Frenzied Regeneration available so you can use it if you're getting a little low on health. You want to make sure you're constantly moving in a circular or side-strafing pattern around them and around Variss. That way you can't get hit by the slam from trying to run through things quickly. Having DBM with all of its timers to keep you up to date is a massive benefit, and I wish I'd used it sooner, so definitely get the DBM Challenges module for Deadly Boss mods. I don't know if Big Wigs or Little Wigs or whatever has anything like that, so I can only really recommend DBM for this guide. Phase 1 will end when Variss is slain, so you'll basically have to keep cleaving down those Nether Horrors, incapacitating Roaring their cast of Storm, Moonfiring the eyeballs, and avoiding Infernal Slam attacks, all while DPSing Variss and interrupting his drain life. I throw Moonfires on basically anything I can, including the Infernals, and use the Ravaged Seed Pod to hit as many dudes as I can, but don't lose track of your interrupts on Variss, or the Tormenting Eyes, and the Nether Storm that basically kills you dead in like 2 seconds. Yeah, I know, it's a lot to learn all at once, believe me. Again, I found keeping Rejuvenation and Regrowth active and using Swift Mend every now and then for healing was a good way to stay alive in between waves of Nether Horrors, as well as helping getting Threat on them when they spawn. Use Barkskin right when the horrors spawn, and it should line up pretty good to cleave them all down while slapping Variss with Mangles and thrashing and swiping whenever you can't. Frenzied Regeneration's cooldown is another way to stay topped up in Phase 1, and you can use at least one of the golden healing orbs that Velen spawns because of how long Phase 1 takes. You might even be able to use 2 safely, but the goal is to kill Variss before you get 3 Infernals, as the fight can get very overwhelming with so much stuff to dodge. I also recommend using Ursol's Vortex, which you get from going with the Restoration affinity. Whenever you can hit multiple Infernals, or if one's really far away, its cooldown is reasonably short, and the Vortex lets you have a little bit more breathing room since it kind of slows things and yoinks them back when they try running through the Vortex, so it can give you just a little bit of wiggle room. Once Phase 1 ends, Phase 2 will begin, and Highlord Kruul comes out to play. Make sure you immediately set Kruul as your focus, as he has a vitally important interrupt that you must get or it's basically a guaranteed wipe. On the bright side for Phase 2, you will no longer have any more Tormenting Eyes or Infernals to spawn, so if you can manage to get to Phase 2 with only 1 or 2 Infernals, then you'll be in pretty solid shape for a kill. The Infernals will still regenerate and come back, but no new ones can show up. If you can ideally line up the kill timings of the Nether Horrors and the Infernals with Varys' death, then you can transition to Phase 2 with no active adds so you can focus on the boss for a bit. Highlord Kruul is a pretty big boy, and he has 2 moves and 1 annoying feature in his half of the fight. Annihilate is your pseudo enrage mechanic, and it's a hard-hitting move that applies a debuff. Each stack of Annihilate makes you take 110% increased damage from the next Annihilate, so it's very likely that without major defensives or tanking trinkets, that you're only going to survive 4 or maybe 5 hits of this move. That's why this phase is well known as a hard DPS check, so our goal is to burn him down before he can hit us that many times. His other move is Twisted Reflections, and this must be interrupted every time. If this cast goes off, you'll get a debuff, and any enemy that hits you will heal for 5% of their max health, including Highlord Kruul. His health pool is massive, so 1 or 2 hits will basically guarantee you can't kill him before those Annihilation stacks get too high. Technically, if you run into one of those golden healing orbs, it'll take the debuff off you, but by the time you got the debuff, he's probably already healed a ton, so it's a wipe, so don't even bother. Kruul will also lunge onto you every now and then and leave a green big puddle on the ground that deals hefty ticking damage and slows you dramatically, so you'll need to move out of these as quickly as you can, which can be very tricky when Shadow Sweep comes out. Shadow Sweep is a bunch of purple beams that sweep across the room and push you around. They also deal damage, but it's honestly a pretty minimal amount compared to how hard everything else hits. But being pushed around or away from your allies or those lovely healing orbs is what will completely ruin your pull. So pop Stampeding Roar and rush through these as quickly as you can. If you can avoid them, then even better, but they cover a lot of space, so it isn't really that simple. You also still have your friends, the Nether Horrors from Phase 1 spawning repeatedly, so you'll need to get thrown on them every time or they'll basically ruin your pull. Whenever I could manage to get a couple hots on myself, it would work pretty good and help generate threat, but in Phase 2, you'll most likely need to use your allies as bait so you can just jump in and swipe and thrash instead. If you can get a couple Moonfires on them, that's great too, but I ended up relying more on just my AoE melee moves to get the retention in Phase 2. To survive all those Annihilates from Kruul though, you need to plan out your defensives, especially if you wore DPS trinkets like I did and don't have like a blood-spattered scale or that trinket off of Kael'thas to protect you. The first Annihilate is not too bad, and as long as you're in bear form and have like 75-80%-ish health, then you don't need any defensives at all. The second one is survivable with a couple stacks of Iron Fur, but it is a little scary if you're low on health. The third one is miraculously survivable with only survival instincts, but I'd recommend at least having some Iron Fur stacks with it because it drops you to basically nothing. I've heard of people living through 4th hit with Barkskin, Survival Instincts, and Iron Fur, but I always panicked and used something too early to test a 4th hit and just died. If you save Incarnation until after the second Annihilate though, it'd probably be much safer due to that 30% larger health pool you get. But I blew it early when I popped my Unbridled Fury Potion and drums when Kruul landed so I could just DPS the crap out of him while I had a good transition and no adds to worry about. If you get to a 4th or a 5th Annihilation, you need to start using those healing orbs to stun Kruul whenever he's about to cast it. If you have enough orbs, then you can keep him locked up for quite a while, and it's also why I took Mighty Bash, since that works out to be an additional stun for a few more seconds of time to DPS him. And there you go, folks. Probably the most thorough way I could explain how I went through all of this trouble because I'm a stubborn SOB sometimes and I really wanted that frickin' Fel Werebear. If you're someone who really truly wants a challenge and don't want to use old gear, then there's nothing wrong with that, but as someone who has basically never touched a tank, I needed that little extra oomph to push the damage phases fast enough to make this fight manageable, at least for my skill level as a Guardian Druid. If you can do it without it, then more power to you, but I do hope this information helps some other people who might need that extra bit of insight and tricks to finish it off. If the video was helpful, then feel free to leave a like or a comment. They'd be truly massively appreciated and would maybe feel like I didn't waste 3 days of playing and over 200 gigs of recorded wipe footage on one boss on a character I never play. As always, my appreciation and gratitude to all of my viewers and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.